Welcome to Saturday Matters, and a lot of you have heard Al before. That's why I think I think it just got timed out. So here is our resident foreign affairs expert, Hal Piper, who is going to start our weekend off with the really cheerful topic of World War III. Seriously. Barry, you've been a doomsayer on the domestic front. We're going to have a doomsayer on a global scale this morning. So good morning, everybody. I'll turn this off so it'll stop squealing.
Okay, yeah. There should be question marks in this title. World War III? Seriously? They didn't show up on the flyer. The question marks didn't. So. You may have noticed in that lamentable presidential debate a couple of weeks ago, Donald Trump said 2 or 3 times, and firmly, urgently, the way he says things, that President Biden will drive us into World War III. Now, he didn't explain why he thinks that, because he's not in the business of explaining why he thinks things, but just making the point. So it falls to me to explain. Too late, Donald? According to a number of pundits and foreign policy experts, or soi-disant experts, World War III is already upon us, and it began even before Hamas attacked Israel last October, and even before Vladimir Putin invaded Ukraine more than 2 years ago. Seriously, this is war. There's no trench warfare, no battle lines, no war bond drives, no Uncle Sam, I want you posters. There are no bombers delivering terror from the skies to civilians. Well, actually there are, and maybe in Ukraine and Gaza, but they're not the world. Each war is different from its predecessor, as the mind of man devises new ways to subdue enemies. Tanks in trenches in World War I, land and sea battles in World War II with mobility and air support. World War III, if it really is here, also shows a different face. A stealth war, an invisible war of cyber attacks, poisonous propaganda, occasional murders in a quiet London suburb, or perhaps at a wedding in Syria or Lebanon, or in orbital space, or from the moon. That's World War III. In the coming paragraphs, I will rely heavily on an analysis by Jonathan Rauch in the Atlantic magazine, dated July 1st of this year. Many of you may have read it, but it deserves wider attention. The world is realigning, the headline informs us. It continues, an emerging axis of resistance confronts the liberal alliance. So those are the two belligerents in World War III, the axis of resistance and the liberal alliance. Here's Rauch's thesis statement. Like a lightning strike illuminating a dim landscape, the twin invasions of Israel and Ukraine have brought a sudden recognition. What appeared to be, until now, disparate and disorganized challenges to the United States and its allies is actually something broader, more integrated, more aggressive, and more dangerous. Well, time out. Who is Jonathan Rauch? And what are his qualifications? He is a contributing writer at The Atlantic and a senior fellow at the Brookings Institution, which is a liberal outfit. He's the author of The Constitution of Knowledge, A Defense of Truth. Rauch is not the only analyst making this argument, but for convenience, I will repeat his conclusion and follow his reasoning. Like a lightning strike illuminating a dim landscape, the twin invasions of Israel and Ukraine have brought a sudden recognition. What appeared to be until now disparate and disorganized challenges to the United States and its allies is actually something broader, more integrated, more aggressive, and more dangerous. So what happened to trigger the twin invasions of Israel and Ukraine? Rauch again. In June 2021, at an annual summit in Brussels, NATO reaffirmed its commitment to the eventual membership of Ukraine, which was also in negotiations to join the European Union. 8 months later, Russian tanks were streaming toward Kiev. NATO, the Americans, and others said it could not extend its security guarantee to Ukraine during a hot war with Russia. The NATO-Ukraine deal was off. at least for the time being. And then on September 22nd, 2023, Benjamin Netanyahu, the Israeli Prime Minister, told the United Nations General Assembly that Israel and Saudi Arabia were at the cusp of a deal normalizing relations, a dramatic breakthrough and a historic peace. 2 weeks later, Hamas, an Iran-backed terrorist organization, invaded Israel, killed 1,200 Israelis and foreigners, took 240 hostages, and set off a war. The Israeli-Saudi deal was off, at least for the time being. I know that there are some diehard progressives, and even maybe some in this room, who will say, see, aha, it is not Putin's aggression, but NATO's encroachment. What was poor Putin to do with NATO at his doorstep? Well, I have a response to that. We celebrated July 4th last week, our escape from British colonialism. Does that argument really, do you really wish to argue that Poland, Lithuania, and all the rest had no right to escape Russian colonialism and choose their own future? Should the American colonists have just bowed their heads and docilely accepted George III's suzerainty? Continuing now with Rauch's analysis, for Russia and likewise for Hamas and Iran, these attacks were epic gambles, the kind of risks leaders take once in a generation. Although the gambles were made in different theaters, their cause was the same. Both actors saw time running out to stop changes that they feared. Time running out. Ukraine's chosen turn to the West. Quick parley in the Kremlin. Uh-oh, do something quick to hang on to Ukraine. 9 months later, a special military operation. Yes, at the moment it seems to be stalemated militarily, but it has rearranged the strategic calculations of the United States and Western Europe. Time running out. Israel about to make peace with Saudi Arabia and other Arab states. Quick parley in Iran. Uh-oh, do something quick to discredit Israel. Scant weeks later, the October 7th sneak attack, which from Hamas's point of view is succeeding brilliantly. Israel has become a global pariah, and American college campuses resound with cries in support of the oppressed Gazans. Yes, okay, but how does this mean World War III? Rauch again. What appeared to be, until now, disparate and disorganized challenges to the United States and its allies is really something broader, more integrated, more aggressive, more dangerous. Over the past several years, the world has hardened into two competing blocs. One is an alliance of liberal-minded, Western-oriented countries that includes NATO, as well as U.S. allies in Asia and Oceania, with the general, if inconsistent, cooperation of some non-liberal countries, such as Saudi Arabia and Vietnam, a liberal alliance for short. The other bloc is led by the authoritarian dyad of Russia and Iran, but it extends to anti-American states such as North Korea, militias such as Hezbollah, terrorist organizations such as Hamas and Islamic Jihad, and paramilitaries such as the Russian Wagner Group, an axis of resistance, as some of its members have accurately dubbed it. Instead of a NATO-like formal structure, the axis of resistance relies on loose coordination and opportunistic cooperation among its member states and its network of militias, proxies, and syndicates. Militarily, it cannot match the US and NATO in a direct confrontation, so operating semi-independently and yet interdependently, it instead seeks to exhaust and demoralize the US and its allies by harrying them relentlessly, much as hyenas harry and exhaust a lion. One country will help another bust sanctions while receiving military equipment from the third. Russia, Iran, and China have also joined forces on the propaganda front, launching waves of disinformation toward the West. Although the Axis normally takes care to keep its hostilities beneath the threshold that would trigger state-to-state military conflict, it can and will resort to direct military confrontation if it sees need or advantage. In the two current conflicts, Ukraine and Israel act not only on their own behalf, but also as surrogates for the broader alliance. Neither Ukraine nor Israel can sustain its position without outside support. That support, therefore, is a primary target of the Axis, which coordinates across both fronts. Russia has ditched its previously warm relationship with Israel to embrace Iran, which supplies the Kremlin with weaponry and equipment. North Korea, likewise, supplies the Russian war effort, and it recently entered into a security pact with Russia. Palestinian Hamas praises North Korea as part of our alliance. Militias aligned with Iran use missiles and drones to strike Israel from Gaza and Lebanon, to strike U.S. forces from Iraq and Syria, to strike Saudi Arabia from Yemen. Even the weakest and poorest of the Axis forces, the Houthi rebels in Yemen, disrupt regional shipping virtually at will. But wait, rewind. What? American troops are in Syria? Yes, a few hundred, less than 1,000. They're officially part of an 80-nation, American-led Defeat Islamic State coalition headquartered in Iraq. But don't ask me to enumerate the 80 nations. They operate legally under the 2001 Congressional Authorization for Use of Force resolution. See what I mean? There are so many vectors of fighting that it is hard to keep track of them all. But do they all add up to a world war? The Axis's principles make no secret of their designs. We are fighting in Ukraine not against the Ukrainians, but against the unipolar world. Unipolar, that is, domination by the sole superpower United States. This is from the Russian ideologue Alexander Dugin. He said this at a conference in Moscow in February. And our inevitable victory will be not only ours, but a victory for all humanity. This is not a return to the old bipolar model, Cold War, Russia-Soviet Union. Not a return to the old bipolar model, but the beginning of a completely new world architecture. New world architecture. China has declared unlimited partnership with Russia. It helps Russia defeat U.S. or Western economic sanctions, and it provides industrial and technological support for Russia's war effort. And it also keeps some distance from Ukraine militarily. Unlike the other constituents of the axis of resistance, China is a great power with its own interests to protect, economic, cultural. And then perhaps separately, there is the nascent space war. China and India have recently landed space capsules on the moon. Russia sent a probe to the moon last year, but it crash landed. The United States plans to make a manned landing in September of 2 years from now, September 2026, which would be 54 years after the last manned mission in 1972. And China is said to be developing a satellite, the Shijian-17, to be fitted with a robotic arm that can seize another satellite and hurl it into outer space. We'll see. Why all of a sudden interest in space after half a century? Well, you know, if those other rascals are up to something, we'd better get up to something too. Pippa Malmgren says it all adds up to World War III. And who is Pippa Malmgren? Well, she seems to be a very versatile person. Wikipedia identifies her as a technology entrepreneur and economist, but she also has gained some reputation as a geostrategist, that is a big picture thinker. She maintains that World War III began in 2021, 3 years ago. She describes a three-dimensional chess game, a hot war in cold places, space, the Arctic and high north. We live in a GPS world, and so we're completely dependent on satellites for not only missile guidance, but Uber Eats, right? We shut down if we don't have that. So what's been happening in space? There's a race to establish the first physical foothold on the moon that will be manned. The main thing is it's kind of the new commanding heights. If you have control of higher orbits and the moon, you can basically take out everybody's satellites from above. So what's been happening in space? The Russians have been targeting their own satellites, the expired ones, particularly the really big ones that weigh like 4,000 pounds, smashing into smithereens, creating this huge debris field. Now, why did they do it? because they're trying to deny access to those critical orbits. You may have seen the report just a week or so ago. The American astronauts who are now twiddling their thumbs at the International Space Station while someone figures out why helium is leaking. But don't say they're stranded in space or NASA will be cross with you. They're not stranded in space. It's just going to be a few weeks before we can get them back. Because of the shrapnel of Russian space debris, the American astronauts had to evacuate the space station just a week or so ago to wait out the danger in their delivery capsule, which apparently is safe, just like NASA says. In the end, all passed uneventfully, but this is why Pippa Malmgren talks of World War III. Not for this event, but for the developing possibilities. Well, think about it. If the Russians from higher orbit can blow up their own satellites for target practice and to scatter roadblock fragments in the space station orbit, what else could they do? Perhaps they could decide to simply take out an American GPS satellite, and we would, and now all the traffic on I-5 would lose GPS, and we couldn't get to the airport to meet our grandchild. And the Uber Eats delivery guy couldn't find University House and bring our pizza. And maybe the whole Pentagon would have to shut down, or worse yet, the Social Security office that sends out our monthly checks. I don't expect any of this to happen anytime soon, because it would trigger a massive retaliation that really might be World War II. And also, satellites are being miniaturized, some to the size of a shoebox. So tough targets maybe for Russian foolishness. But there it is, World War III in incubation. And this realignment, these developments, whether or not they amount to World War III, have taken the United States and other Western powers somewhat by surprise. When the Cold War ended in 1991, there was great optimism in the West. It seemed that our way of life, liberal democracy with its freedoms, had triumphed. Our way was attractive, not least because people get richer in capitalist countries. Gaggles of statistics measured improvements in infant mortality, life expectancy, calories consumed and the quality of those calories, access to education, the life choices available to girls and women, and so on, all showing in many corners of the world measurable improvements in human well-being back in the 90s. Surely all the world would choose to participate in this brave new world. The Western powers invited the autocracies, Russia and China, to join the parade. The G7, group of 7, includes the world's leading economies. Even though Russia was not, by international standards, a leading economy, Boris Yeltsin's Russia was invited in 1977 to join. The World Trade Organization, WTO, writes the rules for, as the name implies, world trade. Even though many of China's trade practices did not conform to WTO rules, China was admitted in 2001. The visionaries, the one-worlders, had triumphed. I'm sorry if I sound sarcastic about this. There was sincere desire in most Western governments at the time to redress the wreckage of the Cold War. When Russia or China cheated, cheated. When Russia or China engaged in activities incompatible with the emerging global standards, they were overlooked as growing pains, part of the adjustment process. As late as 2009, President Obama took office at a low point in relations between Moscow and Washington and announced a reset that would make us not necessarily friends, but partners again where our two countries' interests coincided. That ended in 2014 when Russia invaded and annexed Crimea. China is still a member of WTO and still will not buy its regulations accepted by other members. So where do we stand now? Is it all gloom and doom, liberal democracy in retreat, autocracy on the march? In the realignment of forces, does might make right? Democracy is still attractive. Look at refugee and migration flows. In this chart, the red dots, China, India, Mexico, and others mark outflow, people moving away. Blue dots, US, Canada, Western Europe, denote where the migrants are going. people still want to come to the United States or to Western European countries. Maybe they think they will get richer. Maybe they think they will escape criminal or political oppression. Maybe they hope to score a ticket to Taylor Swift's next concert. But for whatever reason, they would rather live in a democracy than in their homeland. From North Africa, they take their chances on rickety boats crossing the Mediterranean. From Central America, they entrust their lives to the guidance of mercenary coyotes. And still they come in the face of Donald Trump's invective. In Russia, by contrast, there is a brain drain, an outflow, thousands, maybe tens of thousands, and especially of educated, trained people. Note how the bars rise consistently since 2012 and absolutely spike in 2022, the first year of the Ukraine war. This does not necessarily imply that average Russians are against the war. On the contrary, Russians, for the most part, follow Stephen Decatur's famous after-dinner toast 200 years ago. Our country, may she always be right, but right or wrong, our country. And I can't resist recalling G.K. Chesterton's dismissal of Decatur. That's like saying, my mother, drunk or sober? Let them go, Putin has said of the immigrant brain drain. Russia does not need waverers, but patriots. Another strength for the liberal alliance is NATO, the 32-nation defense pact. In the 33 years since the demise of the Soviet Union, many analysts have questioned whether NATO had outlived its usefulness. Just what were NATO members defending each other against, if not the Soviet Union? One answer came in 2001 with the terrorist assault on Manhattan's Twin Towers. It was the first and so far the only time that NATO members invoked Article 5 of the treaty, which states that an armed attack against one member is an attack against all. Some NATO states contributed in various ways to the subsequent Afghanistan and Iraq wars. So that was 23 years ago. Tensions remained in the alliance. Donald Trump was not the first president to complain that many NATO members were free riding, letting the United States pay for their own country's defense. Although he was the first to say bluntly last fall, by the way, NATO is dead, and that should a country not pay its fair share of the cost of the alliance's defense, no, I would not protect you. In fact, I would encourage them to do whatever the hell they want, not to pay. Encourage them to do whatever the hell they want. That them was taken to mean Russia's Putin. Do whatever the hell you want. Trump has no allies, only clients. So NATO, pay up. One NATO member that is paying up is Poland. Just a couple of years ago, Poland appeared to be as complacent as Hungary and on the path to an illiberal government structure. Last year, however, Poland apparently remembered its fraught history with Russia next door and elected a centrist government headed by a former Prime Minister, Donald Tusk. Its defense spending this year will be above 4% of its economic output, about double the expected contribution of NATO members. Today we need, this is Poland's Army Chief of Staff telling a press conference this week, today we need to prepare our forces for full-scale conflict, not an asymmetric type conflict. It intends to increase the size of its active military force from the current 190,000 to about 300,000 3 years from now. Behind only the United States at 1.3 million troops and Turkey, 355,000. Yes, Turkey is a NATO member. They're no longer much of a democracy. And yes, Poland's military force at 300,000 would be larger than those of Germany, Britain, or France. I'll detour here just a bit for a curious example of the axis of resistance's tiny microaggressions undergirding this notion of a brewing World War III. Are you familiar with the expression microaggression? It is usually used in connection with racist or sexist encounters. I understand that you people like watermelon. Or, don't bother your pretty little head, darling, I'll take care of it. Well, here's a potentially serious microaggression by Belarus, a de facto satellite of Russia, against Poland. 3 years ago, in 2021, Belarus set up travel agencies in the Middle East, offering a new unofficial route into Europe. You've read about the migrants crossing the Mediterranean to reach Europe and sometimes perishing when overloaded boats capsize. Oh, fly to Belarus instead. Many migrants accepted the apparently safer passage, where, upon arrival, buses scooped them up and drove them to the Polish border and dumped them there. The European Union reckoned that this scheme was designed to create a crisis in the West, and so it has. So Poland needs NATO. The alliance's coherence is strengthened. Yes, NATO, with years of experience living together and working out disagreements, is a strength of the Liberal Alliance. Shifting focus now. Note the new Russian explanation for the war, Ukraine war. When the invasion began in February 2 years ago, Putin described it as a special military operation, a brief campaign to clean up some old business in a historically Russian province. The implication was that it wouldn't last long, wouldn't affect the home front. As the special military operation dragged on, exposing embarrassing incompetence in the supposedly invincible Russian war machine, Putin kept to his limited war explanation, invoking Tsar Peter the Great and other heroes from history. Putin stuck to the wording, special military operation, to present his, don't call it a war, as a righteous restoration of the accepted status quo ante what, 1917? The wording was so important to Putin that he made it a crime to describe the war as a war, by signing laws that set long prison terms for discrediting the armed forces or spreading false information. Well, now 2 years after 2 years of the most vicious fighting in Europe since World War II, the notion that Russia is not fighting an actual war has become impossible to sustain, given the scale of casualties, the huge increase in defense production, and the frequency of Ukrainian strikes, not only in border areas, but deep into Russian territory. These are not pinpricks. Ukraine, a country with no navy to speak of, has driven the Russian Navy from the Black Sea. They used drones and saboteurs to sink several warships, causing Moscow to pull others back out of range. Almost weekly, an oil refinery or a factory or an airport on Russian soil is set ablaze mysteriously. Careless smokers. In March, Russia dropped the special military operation formulation. This has now, in the Kremlin's words, become a war. When the West joined in on Ukraine's side, it is now an existential struggle akin to that waged by the Soviet Union against Nazi Germany in World War II. We are fighting the massed might of the United States and NATO, Putin says. His spokesman, Dmitry Peskov, said every Russian needed to understand this for the sake of their internal mobilization, a phrase that suggests that the Kremlin is demanding a shift in the national mindset to rally the country behind the war effort. I suppose Putin has a point. Russia is fighting not the full massed might of the US and NATO, but certainly an important prop for its Ukrainian opponent. But whose miscalculation brought Russia to this pass? Do the Russian elites understand the damage Putin's war has done to Russia's interests? In just over 2 years, the number of killed and wounded has passed 500,000. 1/3 of the state budget is now dedicated to Putin's colonial war, money that won't be spent on schools, hospitals, or social services. Isolated from Western financial institutions, Russia appears to be increasingly adopting the Chinese yuan as a unit of account for government transactions. In other words, becoming a de facto satellite of China. Of course the elites know, they prefer not to understand. Have we not learned this lesson from both of our political parties? Republican elites toady to Trump to protect their status and perks. Democratic elites, that is the ones in President Biden's inner circle, defend Joe's mental acuity. We can say that Democratic loyalty is less shameless than Republican toadying, and I would agree. But speaking truth to power, though noble, too often ends in career martyrdom. Ego, Human ego, God's gift of creativity and genius, has a devilish underside of cowardice. So no, do not expect the Russian elites surrounding Putin to talk sense to him, much less to plot against him. That said, Putin has embarked on a major purge of Russia's military hierarchy. Some are accused of corruption, which is pretty easy to find in the Russian military, and Russia generally. Some of incompetence, which is also pretty easy to find. But the sum is an acknowledgement that Putin's war has not gone well, while making the point that none of this is Putin's fault, but a consequence of certain malefactors who now have been dealt with. Earlier this year, the Washington Post spent several months reporting on changes sweeping Russia. The resulting series, Russia Remastered, can only be summarized here. 1, the new Russia is positioning itself as a superpower nemesis of the United States. Putin is working to restore his country's global power of the Soviet era, not as a communist bulwark, but as a champion of Orthodox Christian values and an opponent of liberal freedoms. In a world redivided by big powers into spheres of influence, where authoritarianism is an accepted alternative to democracy. Second, the new Russia claims to defend Orthodox values against Western cultural influences. Putin has outlined a messianic vision to save the world from what he calls a decadent, permissive West, an approach he hopes will resonate in socially conservative nations in the global South. The new Russia is militarizing society and indoctrinating a new generation of patriots. Social media channels tell women how to be good soldiers' wives by not complaining or crying. School children make drone fins, trench candles, custom socks for soldiers with amputated limbs. Liberal humanities programs and universities are shut down in favor of programs that promote nationalist ideology. Fourth, the new Russia is glorifying Stalin and rewriting history to whitewash Soviet crimes. At least 95 of the 110 Stalin monuments in Russia were erected during Putin's time as leader. Of course, there were a lot more than 110 million 40 years ago. Many of them got pulled down after the end of the Soviet Union. Fifth and last, the new Russia is crushing all dissent and restricting personal freedoms. Putin has squashed the political opposition in Russia, making protests illegal, criminalizing criticism of the war, and designating liberal non-government organizations and independent media, journalists, lawyers, writers, activists as foreign agents who must register as such, just like the lobbyists and the foreign lobbyists in the United States must register as foreign agents. Oppression? Who said anything about oppression? It's summer. We Americans had our Independence Day last week, and Russia had its Independence Day last month on June 12th. Russia, one's first reaction, and whom did Russia, a mighty empire, declare independence from? It's a new holiday invented in 1992 by Boris Yeltsin, 6 months after the dissolution of the Soviet Union. So maybe the independence being celebrated is independence from Russia's own immediate past. The date commemorates, June 12th, the date commemorates the adoption in 1990, shortly before the Soviet breakup, of the Russian Declaration of State Sovereignty. There seems to be some muddled thinking here. Vladimir Putin has repeatedly bemoaned the demise of the Soviet Union as the greatest catastrophe of the 20th century. But Putin still graces Russia Day, as it is now known, with patriotic speeches, while the populace enjoys festive sports, festive concerts, open-air gatherings, and colorful fireworks. You'll notice the picture there on the left. Those are the colors of the Russian flag. Ours is red, white, and blue, but theirs is white, blue, and red. Russia does seem surprisingly unified. So concludes Anastasia Edel, a Russian-born American writer and social historian, in an article published last month in The Atlantic under the title, "Why Russia is Happy at War." Happy at war? Despite the war's heavy human toll and near total isolation from the West, she writes, Russian society has not unraveled. On the contrary, it appears to be functioning better than before the war and shows clear signs of once elusive social cohesion. One explanation for this paradox, she continues, national thriving amid unfolding calamity, the paradox, one explanation is that unlike Western states, which are designed to advance the interests of their citizens, Russian society operates with one purpose in mind, to serve the interests of its belligerent state. Adel cites Russia's many centuries of autocracy, of effacing individual rights, leading to an anecdote from her own childhood in the last Soviet years. The message that the individual and individual rights don't count was drummed into us at school. Ya, that backward R there, it's the Russian pronoun meaning I, the subject. I is the last letter of the alphabet, we were told. Americans have been nurtured on ideas of freedom and autonomy. These lead to the innovation and creativity that account for American economic and cultural power. Russians learn to keep their heads down and accept their lot of collective membership. This focus explains the stultification of the Russian economy in normal times. But it may be a strength when the Russian motherland is under assault by outside enemies. Think Napoleon, think Hitler. Despite Western sanctions, and with the help of China, Iran, North Korea, and other constituents of the axis of resistance, the national collective has sprung to life. Soviet-era tanks are hauled out of mothballs. Bread factories get converted to drone production. Kindergartners weave camouflage nets. Everything for victory goes the slogan. Hark, the cry of the high-minded American. Oh, give me a break. The United States is always looking for dragons to slay. If it isn't indigenous people, it's Mexicans. If it isn't communists, it's terrorists, or Iraqis, or Afghanis. Now we have this alleged axis of resistance to justify our militarism. Can't we just get along? I hear you, and I too shake my head. The problem is that the dragons, Putin, Hamas, Iran, and the rest, are looking to slay us. Autocrats and troublemakers feel uneasy and unwanted in a world where democracies find ways to get along. It's kind of fun to be old, don't you think? All the history we've lived through, new challenges turning upside down our previous hard-won wisdom. In the period 1990 to 2010, scholars discussed the obsolescence of major war. Sure, there were brushfire conflicts going on all over the world, but the superpowers at least, and the richer developed countries were working their differences out through diplomacy, treaties, and partnerships, UN agencies, and the World Trade Organization. So what are we to do about it? Are Americans ready to endure hardship for foreign policy choices? For loss of life and wealth? Let Ukraine go. Taiwan too, to China. Perhaps Neville Chamberlain had a point when he opted out of, as he put it, a quarrel in a faraway country between people of whom we know nothing. Come to think of it, why should Venezuela not swallow up most of Guyana? Spanish colonists claimed both together 200 years ago. And if Putin wants Lithuania, there's not much we can do about it, is there? Whether or not it qualifies as World War III, this constellation of crises calls for skill, knowledge, steadfastness and steadiness, and attention to detail. And it comes as a time when U.S. politics is as unserious as ever in our lifetimes. At the NATO meeting this week, Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky said, everyone is waiting for November, including Vladimir Putin. November, what's in November? The election. I absolutely dread the thought of Donald Trump steering the ship of state through the next 4 years. Otto von Bismarck said, or is said to have said, God looks out for fools, drunks, and the United States of America. Well, let's hope the Almighty is up to the task. We'll be hearing impassioned denunciations of Russia, China, terrorists, and other dragons in the coming years. After all, every Yankee Doodle heart throbs with righteous indignation. But for every moral condemnation, of adversaries' actions, Americans need to hear candid assessments of the costs of trying to stop them. Without raising public awareness, political leaders risk bringing about the worst-case outcome, half-heartedly waging World War III and then losing it when an uninformed citizenry won't support it. Thank you. That's all I've got to say.
Now, there was a recent election in Iran with a moderate elected. How will the axis of resistance respond?
Yes, this is the new president of all things, but president isn't really the final authority, unfortunately, in Iran. It belongs to the Ayatollahs. And I've seen stories in which young people, moderate young people who really were kind of hoping for something better, say this isn't going to make any difference at all. Now, I don't know whether that's true or whether that's just discouragement, it's never going to get any better. But we'll have to wait and see. But the president, it's sort of like France, I guess, where they also had an election. The president takes care of, sort of like France in reverse. The president takes care of foreign affairs and defense, and the parliament takes care of internal matters. Well, in Iran, the Ayatollahs take care of defense and foreign affairs, and the president who's just been elected, I guess he'll be paving potholes and building schools.
Well, a job maybe is going.
Pardon?
Perhaps a job has been moved.
Yes, and yeah, and it may become less of a job as time goes on.
Back in the Cold War days, we were all talking about the Sino-Soviet bloc at the same time when there was a great deal of dissension between the two of them. Are these types of dissensions likely to show up in the present relationship, considering that both countries, when they're ascending and strong, tend to be threats to all of their neighbors, including each other?
Dissension among the axis of resistance or among the Liberal Alliance?
Between the Russians and the Chinese long term.
Well, that's the thing. It's not really a very closely knit group. I mean, they cooperate where they see advantage, and I guess where they don't, they won't. China can't possibly be too happy about the sudden alliance between Russia and North Korea, because China has always been the most the outside power that keeps a leash on the North Koreans, for one thing, but keeps them going rather than let them fall into disuse or something. But I suppose, Iran, it supports the Hezbollah in the north of Israel, it supports Gaza, it supports the Houthi rebels, it supports not all of these groups even have identical interests all the time, but they certainly can agree on places where they do want to operate together. How about dissension in the Western ranks? Well, there's been some of that. The President of Hungary, in particular, has been a pretty bad NATO member. Although they talked him into abstaining and allowing Sweden and Finland to join the alliance. But in Italy and in a number of places, there are questions about there's some support for Russia. The far right wing groups in Britain and France and Germany, all of them have got and Slovakia. If anybody cares about Slovakia, but all of them have got rump political groups that are not happy about supporting Ukraine and objectively pro-Putin, whether or not whether or not you can say that they're allied with him. Not strong enough to be allied, I guess. But it's been a surprise how well, at the beginning of the Ukraine war, people were worried that Europeans might love their comfort too much. They were so dependent on Russia for oil and energy, electrical power. Are they willing to suffer a cold winter? Well, it turned out that they were willing to suffer a cold winter, and they have retrained a lot of their energy supplies. Well, that's a lot of money that Putin is losing. He's missing. He's not getting it from Western Europe anymore the way he did. So the alliance is held together better than thought, but that's not to say that everybody is in it for the duration. Let's see.
Xi, Putin, and Trump were conveniently lined up, and you had the ability to decide to eliminate one, which was the greatest threat of World War III. Which one would you eliminate?
Trump, because he's also the greatest threat to a lot of other things, like American democracy.
Biden's got a free shot at it.
Hal, do you and Jonathan have a suggestion about whether the war in Ukraine and such kinetic actions are a distraction from what's going on in space and for other adventures?
I think, particularly the war in space, it doesn't get, and a lot of machinations in the North Pole, the northern polar sea, don't really get a lot of attention. And I think a lot of it is that it may be that governments don't really quite want to acknowledge what's happening in these places. So in that, I don't know that it's because of the Ukraine war. Well, yes, it eats up an awful lot of the front page coverage that the others don't. But there was something about somebody or other cut 4 miles out of one of those undersea cables up near Svalbard, Spitsbergen. Now, was that? You haven't really read much about it, and nobody really quite wants to talk about it, because if you do, then you've got to make accusations or something like that. And you've got to, So I think to some extent, a lot of these really are kind of below the attention span. Partly because governments would just as soon not raise them too high. There may be discussions behind doors, but because then they'll be called on to do something about it, if we knew more.
Are they already doing something about it and we don't know?
That's another question. Yes, that could be. Yeah.
It seems fairly clear from what Trump has already said that he intends to abandon American support for Ukraine. What do you think the consequence of that will be? And that's really a question of whether Europe will support Ukraine well enough. And if Ukraine is lost, what's next?
Oh boy. Yes, I agree with you. It seems entirely likely that Trump is going to abandon support of Ukraine. I think it's interesting. Sometimes the Europeans, when Trump abandons something that the Europeans want, an example was the nuclear deal with Iran. And Trump pulled out of it. He said it was the worst deal anybody ever made, and the Europeans and Iran too kept it going for a couple of years, and then events finally did sort of run away with it. But will they think that they can? It'll be an interesting test to see how far they will or won't go to continue the support of Ukraine. They've been increasing incrementally, as the United States has been incremental too, increasing what they will or won't give to them. Well, for a long time we wouldn't send them anything that might strike Russia. Well, now we do. And so I suppose there are some increments that the Europeans can do. I would think that, I hope anyway, that this whole Ukrainian adventure has been so traumatic for Putin that I doubt if he can get something he can call a victory, he may just calm down for a while and wait till our attention is turned elsewhere for a couple of years, a few years.
Al, on the basis of your last comment, I wonder if you think that Putin would be content with that southern tier in Crimea, which is basically Russian anyhow in Ukraine, and he would stop there, or will he continue? My crystal ball is really fuzzy, but it seems to me that he might well be content with what he's already got.
In fact, he has said as much, I think, or at least hinted at it, that he's got Crimea, and then he's got these 4 provinces that Russia does not, in fact, Donetsk and, I can't remember all of them at the moment, but Luhansk. And he doesn't control all of those provinces, as a matter of all the territory in them. But he might be willing to accept the existing battle lines. He sort of suggested as much, and of course Ukraine says, that's something like 22% of our territory, our internationally recognized borders that you're asking for. We can't accept. He may have to accept it. But I think Putin, I think it's entirely likely that he could say he's got a victory. Of course, it isn't what he was talking about at the war's outset, but I think he might.
When Obama was president, and he apparently okayed or didn't do anything about, or somebody helped him okay that invasion of Putin into Crimea. I wonder who thought that was okay?
I think the United States and the Western countries were so startled by it that they just thought, well, what can we do about it? For one thing, back in the days of empire, Crimea was part of Russia. Ukraine at that time did not control. On the maps, it was not part of Ukraine. It was part of Russia. What happened back in Khrushchev's time? Khrushchev was born in Ukraine. He was a Russian, but he was born in Ukraine. He gave Ukraine as a present. Gave to Ukraine as a present. He gave them Crimea. It didn't matter. It was the Soviet Union. It was ruled from Moscow. Moscow controlled it anyway. But it is contiguous more with Ukrainian territory. So it made some sense, actually, in a way to make the maps look prettier or something like that. And it may be that some people were thinking, well, I don't know by what authority he thinks he can do that. Putin can do that and just snatch it back. But he's done it now, and I think we were just sort of at a loss for how to reply. Subsequently, however, as he has continued to snip away and gobble away at Ukraine, with the Donetsk and Luhansk now claimed as sovereign Russian territory. And then when the attack came, I mean, obviously the decision was made in Washington, but also in Western European capitals. That no, this time we can't just keep watching this happen. We've got to help them. And Ukraine is no match for Russia, so we're going to have to help them. So I think that was the difference.
Isn't it also a century-old quest by the Russians for harbors that don't freeze in over the winter? I mean, old Russia was always needing a port in the south because the north ports would freeze over the winter.
Well, of course, they've got Odessa. I mean, Odessa is Ukrainian. I'm sorry. Yeah, but they do have well, that warm water ports would be one reason why the Russians wanted to take Ukraine in the first place. Yes.
Even after Crimea went to Ukraine, Russia maintained its presence in Sevastopol with a major
Yes.
naval fleet. That was basically their center in the Black Sea. So that even when Crimea was separated or went back to Ukraine or went to Ukraine, there was that very strong Russian presence.
Yes, I think Russians are actually the majority of the citizens of Crimea, and that may be another reason why people decided not really to do anything about it.